You are listening to I Am Refocused Radio with your host, Shemaiah Reed. This show is designed to inspire you to live your purpose and regain your focus. And now, here's your host, Shemaiah Reed.
Welcome to I Am Refocused Radio. We are here again, and this time we have another show lineup for y'all. Today we're going to be talking to Jane Rubin. She has a website you can check out, JaneLoebRubin.com is her website you can go check out. She's not just an award-winning author. She's a two-time cancer survivor, and she has amazing work that you should not just appreciate, but has also ties to history. We're going to learn about all the books that she has written, but her latest novel, Over There, the final chapter of her Gilded City trilogy. It doesn't just tell a story, it also resurrects one. Because when it comes to being in the trenches of World War I, Over There shines a light on a largely forgotten chapter of Jewish American history, one where over 250,000 Jewish Americans served with courage, conviction, and quiet patriotism. So first and foremost, I want to land the airplane and get to my guest right now. Jane, thank you for taking time to be on the show today. How are you doing?
I'm great, and I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Appreciate you being on here. So I know I kind of rushed to the chase, but let's pick up back on the book. When you think about how you got started with the process of writing, this is definitely a heartfelt project. What inspired you to not just dive into history, because obviously you had to do some kind of research, but also into the story?
So, and the history is daunting, and the amount of research is very significant. But I had a 30-year career as a healthcare executive, helping run a large hospital system in New Jersey. And I always had a huge fascination for medical innovation and how that sped up so quickly over time. And then I was hit with a very serious cancer diagnosis about 16 years ago, one where there was no cure. And I really didn't expect to live very long. And it's quite amazing, and due to a lot of innovation, that I'm still here today. But I retired, and I decided that I would start checking off my bucket list. And one of the things I really wanted to do was to understand where the genetic defect that made me get cancer, where it came from in my family. And so I began hunting, and I discovered that it was connected to a great-grandmother, Matilda, who came over from Germany in 1866, a year after the Civil War ended, and had a farm in Harlem with her family, which is, if anyone knows what Harlem looks like today, it's all buildings, it's all built up. And so this was in the years towards the end of the Gilded Age. And for those who watched the Gilded Age series, this was going on while the mansions along Fifth Avenue were being built. Anyway, long story short is I discovered certain facts, and when I retired, I decided that I'd start writing a historical fiction novel about Matilda, because she died and nobody could remember her name, which to me sounded so sad. And I wanted to give her and women like her who were lost in history, some kind of legacy and recognize them. And so I did a lot of research on what medical care was like in the 1880s in New York. It brought me into the immigrant experience, the Lower East Side, the poverty that so many American ancestors lived in. And from it grew great innovation, industry, geniuses in the sciences and entertainment and all across the board. And it wasn't just the Jewish population, it was every single ethnic group that immigrated at that time. And together they wove the tapestry of what New York is all about and what large areas of the Northeast are all about. So the first book, Threadbare, is an ode to Tilly, my great-grandmother. And in that book, she has a younger sister, Hannah. And in the second book, In the Hands of Women, it's a book about Hannah being one of the first doctors, OBGYNs in New York City, dealing with a desire to help the healthcare for women at a time when there were no reproductive rights, or even simple things like birth control were illegal. And so we had this massive immigration, these women who had no protection at all. We had huge family sizes. We had very, very high infant mortality rates. 1 out of every 5 babies died before 1 year old. It was awful. And the average lifespan wasn't even 50 yet. And that's because there were no antibiotics. And so people lived crowded together in the lower part of Manhattan. Infections spread quickly. And Hannah, who's a doctor, really wants to bring a better experience, a better protection to women. And so she gets wrapped up with some of the suffragettes who were trying to reverse a Comstock law regarding birth control. And that gets her into quite a pickle. And so that book, In the Hands of Women, is about Hannah's experience. Over there, that was published in May, takes the medical people from the family into 1917, when the United States, after 3 years of watching Europe at war, not wanting to get involved because there were so many immigrants in the United States at the time who had family over there, and really wanted to try and stay neutral. But the Germans did a couple of very inciting things, including the sinking of the Lusitania and trying to coerce Mexico to attack the United States at its southern border in exchange for giving Mexico back Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and Southern California. Can you imagine that? And that took Congress over the top, and we declared war on Germany and began sending our boys from every nationality under the sun into training camps. Well, it's really an interesting time, and there were a lot of lessons that we could learn from this. 20% of the Army was made up of immigrants. It was made up of either first-generation immigrants or those who were born outside of the United States. And a very disproportionate amount of the Army was made up of each of these different ethnic groups. For example, my family's Jewish, and so I looked at that first. And at the time, 1917, 3% of the United States was Jewish, but 6% of the Army was. And then it got me thinking, I wonder about the other nationalities. So I looked at the Italians, because the Italian neighborhoods were very close to the Lower East Side in Lower Manhattan, and 3% of the population was Italian, and 13% of the armed forces were Italian. That's amazing. That's an amazing number. And so it made me think of why. Why did all of these young men step forward and fight for the United States? I mean, can you imagine this today? I mean, it's really like a lot to wrap your head around. And there's a number of reasons, but aside from the fact that 6 months in or so, they were offered a fast-track citizenship, which was nice for them, of course. But most of them had come from Europe because they really wanted to get into a society that offered more than they had at home. They were living in poverty. There were no jobs. There may have been political oppression. The Jewish people were really getting oppressed by the Russians. There was safety issues every day. And so they had, even though they were poor in the United States, in that poverty, they felt safe, because they little by little were getting jobs, they were feeding their families, their children were beginning to get educated, like they were putting the footprint into the American dream. And they really felt very patriotic. So it just was a very interesting time. So given all that, I decided to take my medical characters to the medicine side of the war, not the trenches, and get into the battlefields, which are also very, very interesting. But I really wanted them to be the first person observers of some of the remarkable innovations that occurred during World War I, which was the first war with modern warfare, like machine guns and mustard gas. But it was also the first war where we had ambulances, and we understood the importance of time to care. So to get those boys off of the battlefield and begin taking care of them had a huge bearing on how well they did, or if they lived or died. So ambulances were key. Antiseptics were key. Machine guns caused shrapnel, sprayed pieces of metal that got lodged in the body. And they were able to take portable X-ray into the hospitals near the battlefield. Never before have they been able to do something like that. They had blood transfusions. So all of a sudden, the opportunities to help the wounded lifted. And I wanted my characters who I'd been developing in the first two novels to be tested. How would they do under all of that stress? And I have some pretty interesting scenarios where not all of them did that well. And so we begin to see the human response from the medical side, not just from the soldiers who were under so much horrible pressure. That's a pretty long answer. I'm sorry. But I'm fourth book too now, so I could just keep going.
That's good. I always like my guests to have the spotlight because that's the best way to learn everything that you have put together for our audience. When you, and first, real quick, listen to Refocused Radio, watching us online or listening to us on radio, talking to our guest, Jane Rubin, go to her website, janeloberubin.com, and catch all the books. You probably going to need some popcorn, too, as a snack, because it's probably going to be a page turner. But
I've been told they're page turners.
With the history, that is very important. A lot of times it can be overlooked. A lot of times it can be misunderstood. How, when you look at today's news and the world, it's still antisemitism still out there, still things going on where people still feel like there's a target on their back. How is it important for younger people to really take the time to learn history? Because
I think, listen, I really believe that in this country, people are entitled to draw their own conclusions and have their own opinions. I think it's one of the things that's so fabulous about the United States. But I do have a caveat. It should not come based on ignorance. It should not come based on stuff you see in 30 seconds on your phone, or things that people tell you under the impression that they're facts. It should come from a strong understanding, not only of current events, but of historical events. For example, In the Hands of Women, which has been an extremely popular one of the books in the series, deals with reproductive rights. I wrote it and finished it a year before Roe v. Wade was overturned. And the states could decide what they wanted to do about abortion rights. But the book itself deals with what was the world like when women could not have birth control, when women could not end pregnancies. What was it like for them? Do you know that half of the terminations or abortions, if you want to use the A word, in the United States in 1900 were by married women, not women who were single, had gotten themselves in a difficult corner. They were married women, and there are many reasons for it. Family sizes were huge. There was high mortality rates for moms. There were high mortality rates for children. And it put a huge burden on the family. And it was very difficult to enjoy your family because you were constantly struggling. And I don't know if you have kids, but for people who do, 2 or 3 children is really a pretty full plate. The average family size was between 5 and 7, and there were small quarters. They didn't necessarily have the money to clothe and feed their family properly. And so women sought out early term abortions. Now, in the 1880s, 1900, the feeling, even by the church, was that life began when the mother felt movement, which is 18 to 20 weeks. And prior to that, there was no life of the fetus. Now, we know that the fetus matures faster than that. But at the time, which is what a historical novel is it takes you into the time, not with modern knowledge, but with the knowledge that they had then. Midwives did most of the terminations, and they used herbal medications that created cramping and uterine contractions and often resulted in a miscarriage. And they didn't call it abortion. They had like really funny names like relieving the flow, giving the woman back her menstrual cycle. And so we found that 50% of terminations were married women. But in 1900, 2 specialties surfaced. One was obstetrics and gynecology, and the second was anesthesia. And they became practitioners in that specialty, and they were hospital-based. So what happened was that they wanted to get the midwives out of the picture. And so they used the laws to really push them off. And women came to the hospital getting anesthesia for childbirth, and they were trying to reclaim that business. They felt it belonged to them. So it was really a business struggle. It was not a moral struggle. It was a dollar struggle. And what happened with the midwives is that they lost the opportunity to do their deliveries to the doctors. And so they began to become more underground, doing more and more terminations, taking them closer to 18 to 20 weeks, where they were far more dangerous and required instruments. And you must realize that at the time, midwives weren't like they are today, where they have nursing degrees and they go to midwifery school and they take anatomy classes. These midwives at that time were trained by the apprenticeship method. So they really were not qualified to touch anything inside the body. And they were. And so very horrible things started happening to women, and more were coming into the hospital bleeding. And that is the world that my protagonist, Hannah, becomes part of. And that's one of her challenges in the book, is how to deal with this.
When you think about the process it takes to get this all done and get out to the world to see it, and you start the process of marketing to readers out there, I can imagine the response you had from the first to the second to the third. What have you learned from each book, and has that marketing ever evolved over time as you release?
Yeah. I have definitely developed a following, and a very loyal following. They love the fact that they're learning a lot of history and things they didn't know when they read my books. I always have a bibliography in the back, because if they don't agree with what I'm talking about as facts, they could check it for themselves. I really open that door because I really believe that an informed person makes the best decisions, and an uninformed person tends to be disappointing, believes a lot of things that aren't necessarily true, and can also be very defensive about it. So I have had audiences where a few people really challenged me, and I welcome that. I tell them, you have no idea what my position is on abortion. You have no idea. But I will tell you, I really believe in birth control. And I think people should be knowledgeable about birth control, and I think they should plan their families accordingly so that every baby who is born is wanted. I said, that is what I believe in. And I said, if you have trouble with that, then maybe we have a problem. But beyond that, you have no idea what I believe in. I'd never revealed it in the book. And as a matter of fact, all I really aspired to do was to do a very deep research into what it was like when there were no women's rights. And I guess it does beg the question, do we want to return to that world? So, food for thought.
If you're just now joining us, you listen to I Am Refocused Radio. I'm talking to our special guest today, Jane Rubin. Go to her website, get copies of her book, JaneLobeRubin.com. Time is already melting like ice, but when you understand the concept of, okay, not only am I a writer, I'm a successful writer now. People are connecting to my stories. They're connecting to my mission of what I'm trying to present. Is that something that you always train for beforehand? Because you hear about writers who this is like my whole life, and other writers just like, well, I was inspired to just do this project. What was it like for you, and how did that give you an edge?
I was ill prepared. I tripped over backwards into it at the age of 65. I've been at it now for 6 years. I have 3 books out and a 4th one coming, and I have been really successful, partly because I write about things that I find important to me in a historical context. And they just happen to be issues that cycle in history over and over and over again. Women's rights has been cyclical. Immigration has been very cyclical. War has been probably the most predictably cyclical, horrible historical pattern. And the impact war has on not only the soldiers, but the medical workers who take care of them, and also their children left home and their wives and their families struggling to live with constant worry. And these are issues that in my mature age really resonate with me. I'm not a contemporary women romance writer. I mean, those books, I'm not a beach read writer. I'm not a lot of those things because they don't resonate with me. And I'll read those books too in my spare time, but I don't want to spend a year writing one. I don't want to use what's left of my life to write for money. I really want to write for myself and an audience that cares about these issues. And I'm finding that there are a lot of people out there who do and who want to talk about it. Threadbare for many of my audience is sentimental. For those who are 3rd or 4th generation from immigrants, they are still hearing shreds of stories. Most of the stories have been buried in history, but my work brings them up, and they love raising their hand in an audience and sharing stuff, which is fabulous. When I did the last program on Over There, someone stood up and said, I have to share something that was like a miracle. And it was in the trenches in France, and her grandfather was a soldier, and in his platoon, there were several Jewish soldiers, and it was a very big holiday called Yom Kippur, and it's a day of fasting, a day of prayer, and a lot of religions have holidays similar. And he had seen a synagogue in a town nearby, and he asked the commander if he and 3 other men could go to the synagogue for prayer. And they were allowed to go. And while he was gone, the rest of his platoon was shot to pieces in the trenches. Not one soldier remained. And so when he came back, they were the only ones left living. And so he always felt that it was sort of God looking out for him. But when she got up and started sharing that, it made it feel so personal and real. And it made you forget that it was 1917 and, over 100 years ago, but that these were real living people dealing with like frightening circumstances, and they were finding solace in their religion. And it could have been any religion, any group, but it just happened that her grandfather was Jewish. I had 2 grandfathers who were Jewish who served in World War I. My father served in World War II with his 2 brothers. All 5 of them served in active combat. My father flew a fighter plane, a B-25 in the Pacific. He was only 21 years old. He was dropping bombs. My son at that age was rushing a frat house. Their whole idea of brotherhood was so different. And yet they never talked about it. So when I came up to that time period in the series, it was important to me to spend some time really understanding war. And so that's why I picked something not sentimental, like war. But the next book is sentimental.
I appreciate you sharing that. I really want to highlight the part where you share about the lady who stood up to share her small piece of story. And that's what's amazing about not just what you just said about that, but just the show in general. People love stories. And when we do something, it's amazing how that can trigger someone wanting to speak up and share their piece. I want to ask you real quick, now it's a curveball, but when you get that kind of interaction with readers of your book, does that sometimes spark you some curiosity of maybe something you might use in your next book?
I haven't used anyone's actual story per se, but I'm always listening. And you have to remember, too, is that I'm not a 35-year-old writer who hasn't experienced that much of life yet. I've experienced a lot of life, and it hasn't been always so easy. So I have a huge well of experience to draw from, and I do. And as a matter of fact, I'm almost done with the 4th book, which takes my characters to the beginning of the hotels in the Hudson Valley Borscht Belt, which is in Sullivan County. But the 5th book, which I'm contemplating, is probably going to be a fictional autobiography of my life in the 50s, late 50s and 60s, growing up at a time when women's rights were also getting punctuated, and how confusing it was for young women to figure out who they were and what to be, and what does a marriage look like, and what does a career look like, and do you have to stop working if you have a family? And I mean, we were caught in between, the old Leave It to Beaver and My 3 Sons, and Full House. We were a generation that was really straddled between 2 very, very different sets of values, and it's going to be a really interesting exploration into my foundational years.
Well, when that comes out, I might have to have you back on so we can kind of tease that up a little bit. But once again, been listening to I Am Refocused Radio and watching us online, talking to our guest today, Jane Rubin. Go to her website, get all her books, and get up to date to when she's going to drop the next one. JaneRubin.com is the site to go to. Like always, I want to say to you, thank you for your time.
Oh, this was lovely. Thank you. And good luck with your programming and your future plans. Thank you for inviting me to be on your show.